Michael Imerman joins us. He's an assistant professor of teaching and finance at the University of California, Irvine. Listen, this story is so fascinating to me. You got businesses moving their large accounts, and it may have been the final blow for First Republic, but I'm curious what you think. What do you think is the bigger issue? FDIC protection or banks behaving badly again after the huge bailout in 2009, or is it both?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, with any kind of bank run, which ultimately led to Silicon Valley Bank's downfall, and what we saw in kind of slow motion over the past month with First Republic Bank was a panic. Anytime there's panic in the public, people tend to withdraw their money from the banks that are in the spotlight and move them to banks that they view as safer. That's namely been the too big to fail banks. So there's several problems going on here. One is curbing the panic and the effects of the bank run. And the other one is the issue that we dealt with 15 years ago during the global financial crisis. We thought we dealt with, which was too big to fail. But the problem is with these regional banks failing and people and companies moving their money into the larger banks, those larger banks are getting bigger and healthier, and too big to fail is a problem once again.
And, it's when you say the phrase that it's almost like we saw this in slow motion, it's like that, but also almost instantly with nowadays everything being digital, and how when you mentioned just the feeling and confidence, it really can happen much quicker if you lose faith in the banks. We heard Representative Khanna mention $8 trillion, which is how much money businesses currently have deposited. At the end of 2022, the FDIC Deposit Insurance Fund only totaled $128 billion. How would all businesses be covered?
Right. So that's the other problem. So we talked about too big to fail, and we talked about bank runs. The Deposit Insurance Fund was started in response to the Great Depression almost 100 years ago. And it's worked pretty well at curbing panics that ultimately lead to bank runs, because people feel more secure that they are protected up to that limit. It was 100,000 up until 2008. More recently, for the past 15 years, it's been 250,000. So as long as businesses and individuals stay below that threshold, they're protected. The problem is, as you mentioned at the start of the segment, with First Republic and with Silicon Valley Bank, there were high net worth individuals and businesses that had millions of dollars in deposits, that meaning everything above and beyond that $250,000 is not insured. And that's what caused that panic. Now, you mentioned that this all happens almost instantly, and that's because of the fact that we're all connected 24/7. So that's the other factor that's impacting this crisis, is the fact that we've got social media, we've got streaming news 24/7, and people are constantly monitoring these messaging boards, monitoring social media, looking at their news apps, and communicating with one another and coordinating. That ultimately leads to this bank run. Coordination is something that in the literature, researchers have studied for decades now, that leads to a bank run. And that coordination among depositors is instantaneous now because of communication and messaging.
Yeah. I mean, to that point, then I have to ask and level set here, because more than 99% of U.S. deposits hold less than $250,000, already covered. How much do people have to worry about their banks and the banking system?
Well, those are two different questions. How much do people have to worry about the banks and their bank in particular, and the banking system? I think individuals, most retail investors, as you mentioned, over 90% of retail bankers, not investors, rather, retail depositors are going to be below that $250,000 threshold. So that's not the problem. Now, when they see streaming messages and streaming news about a potential bank failure, that's when they panic, even if they are below that threshold. And that's where the irrationality comes in. But as long as the balance is below the $250,000, everybody's protected. Now, the problem is with those uninsured deposits, and that's why I think the key part of this proposal that's going to Congress that the FDIC drafted is potentially expanding coverage to businesses. That's what they call targeted coverage. So it would be different accounts get different levels of coverage. And that's what is most interesting to me and potentially most effective.
Michael Imerman, Assistant Professor of Teaching and Finance at the University of California, Irvine. Thank you so much for your insight and expertise here. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.